and welcome to the Mithila Review Show. I'm your host, Ishita Singh, Managing Editor of Mithila Review, the journal of international science fiction and fantasy. The Mithila Review Show will be an inclusive platform that hosts writers, editors, publishers, and readers from around the world to expand the conversation about speculative imaginations of past, present, future, and beyond. Through a series of fun, thought-provoking, and entertaining conversations, we hope to explore new literary frontiers and diverse worlds. In our first episode, writer, lawyer Zen Cho will be conversing with Tejasvi Rawal about her latest book, Blackwater Sister, about non-English languages in fantasy, history, and macaroons. Zen Cho is a Malaysian fantasy author based in the United Kingdom. She's known for her Sorcerer to the Crown novels, historical fantasies with a post-colonial sensibility about magicians in 1800s London. She has also published a short story collection, Spirits Abroad, and her novella, The Order of the Pure Moon Reflected in Water, is about nuns and bandits in a wuxia take on emergency Malay. Her newest novel, Blackwater Sister, is a contemporary fantasy. She is the recipient of the Crawford Fantasy, British Fantasy, and Hugo Awards, and was a 2013 finalist for the Astounding Award for the Best New Writer. I hope you enjoy this episode.
First of all, so glad to meet you.
It's nice to meet you too.
My name's Tejasvi, and obviously I work at Mithila, and we're very interested in science fiction and fantasy. And I raised my hand to interview you because I'm so interested in your work and what you do.
Thank you.
And I thought that we could begin with language. So when I was reading Order of the Pure Moon Reflected in Water, I noticed that it incorporates a lot of words from the Malaysian language. And I wanted to ask you how you approach including this real life language, where readers expect constructed languages in fantasy, and how you approached that kind of decision and what effect it has.
Yeah, that's something that's come up before. So it was raised by a Singaporean reviewer who read Order, and he mentioned kind of the challenge or the perceived challenge of including non-English languages in a genre that, as you say, often features kind of made up languages. I have to say, just never occurred. I mean, it never occurred to me to even worry about that. I mean, I suppose there's an element of like, so what? It just doesn't bother me. If anything, the fact that like some fantasy readers can be assumed to be familiar with Elvish or Dwarvish or whatever, used to, those kind of stereotypical names with all the apostrophes, and you'd sort of think would make them more receptive to non-English terminology being used. So I start from the inside out. I Order of the Pure Moon is most of the characters, all the main characters are essentially ethnic Chinese. That world is a secondary world, but quite closely based on our world in many respects, and they're kind of direct analogs for the kind of major races of the Malay Peninsula. So they're mostly ethnic Chinese. So the kind of thinking there was they would be speaking in Chinese dialect. And in fact, I'm usually quite clear about which dialect they're speaking, but I wasn't in this case. I assume actually it's a mix of dialects. But so the kind of conceit, if you will, is that the dialogue, although the book is written in English and the dialogue is in English, it's actually kind of translated, or it's like subtitles of a Chinese dialect. And so part of the reason why Malay words appear from time to time in the dialogue and the narrative is because if you speak Hokkien or Cantonese or Mandarin or Hakka in Malaysia, you often will use lots of Malay loan words. And so there's also kind of quite interesting YouTube videos by like Malaysian vloggers who will talk about, like Chinese speaking vloggers who will talk about how the local version of the language is different and how certain terminology, because because the Chinese community in Malaysia has been there for a while, so the language has developed and the accent is different and the words are different. Not all the words, obviously it's mutually intelligible, but they're kind of local twists. So that's kind of how I approached it. So an example that not a lot of people have picked up on, actually, because you need to be able to speak Malay and be a bit familiar with Hokkien even to kind of get this point. But one word that's quite frequently used is mata, which means police in the story.
I did notice that, yeah.
So because they're slightly on the wrong side of the law, these people. So so the mata are quite a big element in their lives, but actually the word in Malay is mata-mata for police, because mata itself, if you don't double it, means eye, and then if you repeat it, mata-mata means police. But the reason why I went with just mata is because in Hokkien that's the loan word. So rather than saying mata-mata for police, they say mata in Hokkien spoken in Malaysia. I mean, so that was one thing I did. So it just didn't really ever occur to me to kind of worry at all about it's being taken as like a construct or anything like that. But I kind of feel as well, like if you're writing fantasy inspired by a region that's so poorly understood at a global level as Southeast Asia, you just need to like not worry about kind of being misunderstood, because it's going to happen. So it's just kind of, in what regard are you prepared to be misunderstood, I guess.
I think that's a very interesting decision, because did you ever think about including something like a glossary for the words that you used often? That's just
no. Well, no. Not unless I'm asked to by a publisher. And generally, I don't, because I'm conscious that I write for a majority Western audience, and even and lots of kind of non-Westerners as well who aren't familiar with the Malaysian languages and so on. So I always I always try to write the story so it's intelligible. You can follow everything that's happening, whether you understand all the words used or not. Everything should be clear from it's either going to be clear from context, or you don't need to know it really. Like you can have a broad idea. It's not, and I think I can see why some people use glossaries. I think it's stuff like and I was thinking about this quite a lot in the context of Blackwater Sister, my newest novel, because that uses a lot of Manglish or Malaysian English, a lot of Hokkien, a lot of Malay. I don't think it uses that much of any of those things, but I guess more than the average English language book. And I did get asked by my so this didn't come up with Order of the Pure Moon, but with Blackwater System, maybe because it's a novel and actually uses far more of kind of non-English terms. I was asked, do you want to give a glossary? Do you want to footnote it? Do you want to explain things? And I thought quite hard about this at the editorial stage, and I decided, no, I don't want to do all those things. And as part of the process of working through that, I considered lots of different options. So I thought about, okay, because if you do a glossary, let's say, you have to choose which words go into that, which means you have to decide which words are not going to be legible to your audience, which means you have to think about your audience. And so one thing I wanted to do was not, if you just decide, all right, it'll be all the words that the Americans don't understand, then you are basically saying the Americans are my primary audience. Now, the book is published, Blackwater Sister is published in the US and UK, but my kind of notional audience is always an audience that's quite like me, quite self-centered. So, and so it was really important to me for a book that's set in Malaysia and about Malaysians, that it was, well, primarily about Malaysians, that wasn't so clearly defined that the audience wasn't Malaysians, if that makes sense. Like I always sort of try to target, I always think of a Malaysian when I'm writing something like that. So one option I actually considered was, why don't I do a glossary and all the American terms can be explained, like stuff like I could explain what junior year means. That's their third year in university. We don't tend to say that in Malaysia, stuff like that. And well, one thing that rapidly became clear was that it would be an enormous amount of work. So I think this is kind of interesting because it's kind of an example of the labor that like a Western author doesn't have to engage in, like, and equivalent books in the market, Crazy Rich Asians, Last Tongue Standing by Lauren Ho, they have footnotes, for example, of kind of unfamiliar terms. Lauren Ho does it quite cleverly, actually. Last Time Standing, her footnote is kind of the same voice, because it's a first-person narrative, and it's, they're funny. I haven't read Crazy Rich Asian, so I can't really comment how that's done. But again, like that's an extra level of work that like a lot of Western authors aren't being asked to do. So, but what I came to, and I also posted on Facebook and asked Malaysian friends what they thought of it, is the same conclusion that several kind of Malaysian readers shared with me at the time, which is, we receive in Malaysia primarily, if you're reading English in Malaysia, you're primarily reading books by American and British and Canadian and Australian and so on authors, and this stuff isn't footnoted for us. The classic example is stuff like Enid Blyton, where they used to eat macaroons. Like when I was growing up, I just.
For the longest time, I thought a macaroon was like one piece of macaroni.
Yeah, same, uncooked.
For me,
it was like uncooked.
Common cultural experience.
Because I knew they were crunchy, so I thought they had to be uncooked, like
raw macaroon. And I remember there was an Enid Blyton book in which someone said, "Oh, I've eaten 7 macaroons. That's so many," and I was so confused.
I mean, there's quite a lot of raw macaroni. Even one raw macaroni is too much to eat.
Yeah, that's true.
So yeah, no, I had exactly the same thing. So it's kind of like, but and other examples, but you get this sense, you can sorry, I don't know if you got that, but I got a call. Hopefully you can edit it out.
That's okay.
But I think, we as readers from a different society, from different culture, you work things out from context, and actually it's part of the pleasure of reading a book from another country or another context. You kind of learn about it by being immersed in it. So I thought that was a pleasure I shouldn't deprive my Western readers of, really. But another equivalent example is stuff like anime or K-dramas, which are created for their market and their kind of cultural context, and those don't. I guess anime, you might get subtitlers who explain things in the subtitles, but often, obviously the original kind of work doesn't really explain itself in that way. It doesn't say, oh, by the way, in our cultural context, it's very important to respect your family. Oh, whatever. Like it just like, it's like, okay, just take it for what it is. And you can see that those forms are very popular in the West. So why not? Sorry, that's a really long answer, but it's something I think a lot about.
No, but I think that's a very interesting answer, because these are the kind of things I was thinking about, especially because I felt first, maybe it's because I have a connection to Malaysia, but I don't think it's concrete enough for me to have such a varied experience from someone who didn't know anything about Malaysia, where it felt more genuine and within the flow of a narrative, because it's not being explained to me as some kind of meta narrative, if that makes sense.
Exactly. The explanations disrupt the suspension of disbelief. Yeah.
And then, of course, when we're talking about narratives, we're talking about languages. These are all things that are so bound up in history. So with The Order, I wanted to ask you about how you balance the real world history. I think you've said before that it's somewhat based on the emergency in Malaysia, and how you balance that history of real world loss with this fantasy world.
Yeah. It's an interesting question. I mean, fantasy takes on history and historical conflict are obviously really common. So I guess Game of Thrones was inspired by real history. I guess arguably Lord of the Rings, although not kind of directly. And in fact, I think Tolkien would have abhorred anything like trying to fictionalize the world wars he lived through. But obviously, in a deep sense, it draws a lot on his experiences of World War I and so on. I guess what's a bit different about Order is that it draws on a conflict that firstly isn't that well known, perhaps on the global stage, but secondly also it's a very recent conflict, and a conflict that where the storytelling, the narratives around it are still very conflicted. They're not agreed, right? Like they're contested. They're heavily contested in Malaysia, and so I can see, I don't know, like I sort of grappled a little bit about kind of like I tend to write quite funny books. That's just how I see the world. And there was a bit of grappling about like, is it appropriate, I guess. But ultimately I guess I feel that it's kind of fair game to explore something like that. It's just in terms of my position and the history, it's something that I really wanted to understand better, like something the emergency Malaya, I think is kind of partly because the narratives are so contested and you don't get the full story from the kind of history textbooks in Malaysia. I think it's something that just seems really pivotal to the story of the nation. um and so just the way that I explore things is through writing fiction. I guess part of the fact that I fictionalized the world, the secondary world setting, meant that I could kind of remove myself from kind of the direct kind of historical detail, and maybe worry a bit less about kind of all these issues of representation, accuracy, and so on. What I was doing, I guess, was thinking much more about kind of the emotional side of things and kind of exploring it that way. Yeah, that's not the most coherent answer, but that's kind of what I had in my mind about that.
No, I think it's a wonderful answer, because what I wanted to ask you about was exactly this, about this kind of this kind of distance and yet closeness to what really happened. And again, I think what I come to now is how what you were saying about the contested histories is very much borne out between the character interactions, where they seem to have very different interpretations of what happened to them even a few years ago, because they're in such different groups and they approach things in such different ways. So when I read it, I was so fascinated by the way in which the world of the book seems to build out from the characters rather than by putting the characters into a world. So how do you approach fleshing out your characters in this way, where they feed into the histories?
Um, well, so how the story came about. Usually, how I find a story that I'm interested in writing is kind of two things. There's generally like a character dynamic, a relationship dynamic that I want to explore, and then there's a setting, a kind of like a world element that I want to explore. So the kind of initial sparks, and you sent me the interview questions in advance, so I know you've kind of seen this before. One of the initial sparks was the Rogue One movie, the Star Wars Rogue One movie, and I got really into the two Chinese dudes played by Jiang Wen and Donnie Yen, who are these kind of like brothers in arms. They're kind of monks, fighting monks who are kind of brothers, and that was such like a familiar dynamic to me. Like from like I growing up, I didn't watch all that much Chinese language media myself, but it was always on TV. It was around me, and obviously I watched some of it, and that kind of trope of these like fighting monks, and like tropes like this kind of camaraderie amongst like brothers in arms and that kind of thing, all felt really familiar to me, and I thought that it'd be really interesting to do that. And I had this idea of like a story about a couple bandits, like a nun who joins a band of bandits and actually finds out one of them used to belong to her order. I was really interested in this idea, and then, but it didn't gel until I kind of found the setting, which was like, I was like, oh, what would be interesting is if it wasn't just a kind of classic kind of wuxia style, kind of South China pre-industrial setting, but if you kind of mixed it up and it was a fantasy setting, but it was based in 1950s Malaya, roughly. 1940s, 1950s, and I thought, okay, that would be really interesting. So then because I guess I started with that relationship dynamic that I was interested in, it started in the characters, and that's a good way I feel to build a world, because you then kind of tell the characters just about as much as you tell the readers just about as much as the characters need to know, and that's just really all the readers need to know to kind of follow the plot. But yeah, it is a story that is very much about kind of, as you say, the characters have different asymmetric kind of levels of understanding of what's happening around them, and so you can but kind of narratively that's fun as well to play with, because you can kind of feed the reader information at different points of the story for kind of maximum impact.
And now that you've mentioned obviously Star Wars, I wanted to really ask you about kind of how all of these inspirations coalesced. You mentioned anime, you mentioned obviously history, all of these things. How did all of this coalesce? And what would you say about taking inspiration from things like anime, which, especially I think in Western audiences, is kind of denigrated as an art form? Much less maybe in recent years, but it certainly is seen as kind of a juvenile art form.
Yeah, I think in SFF there's less of that, maybe, particularly my generation of writers working today would say a lot of them take inspiration from anime, from gaming, so from all these kind of, quote unquote kind of low culture forums. Wuxia, I guess, is another one that's a kind of popular genre. So I think although maybe there still is an element of this, like again with Blackwater Sister, I was digging into about this recently, and main character starts out very underpowered. She's kind of a broke college student, or she's just graduated rather. She's unemployed. She's a bit she's drifting. She's got a girlfriend, but she's not out to her family. And I was asked, though, she starts out very kind of powerless. Where do you get the kind of inspiration for that from? And I mentioned Yuri on Ice, the anime, where the main character Yuri, he's an ice skater who's just had a very kind of catastrophic career failure, really, and it feels career ending. And he goes home to Japan, and that's the start of the series, and you kind of see him build himself back up. And when I mentioned it, like people seem to find that quite funny, but I think they were just laughing because
I think it makes sense.
Yeah, well, me too. But I think they're just laughing in like pleasure in a way, like being like, "Oh, I love you and nice too," or whatever. But I know what you mean in that it's not always expected. Like if you write novels, especially like if you write novels where it's like, oh, my novels deal with colonialism, they grapple with gender, they grapple whatever. You've got all these like big words floating around. You're maybe not really expected to kind of be also drawing inspiration from low culture. But I think to me, that kind of perceived incongruity and the juxtapositions of different elements really is what interests me, and that's something I find very creatively stimulating. So definitely the main materials I would say feed my creativity is not just like shows and movies and books. But I read, when I read, and I read these for fun, like nonfiction, I'm often reading kind of academic texts and so on. They look terribly serious. They often have incredibly long titles and colons and so on. But and they're inspiring, but it's also really inspiring to like watch an anime that I get really into, or a K-drama or something, just like work out the dynamics that I find kind of creatively kind of compelling about those things. So it's I think it's a little mixture of all that stuff, and it kind of makes kind of it makes me I feel like it makes me capable of writing something that's more kind of rich and kind of has more body than if I was just kind of drawing from one source.
I think also when we're speaking about inspiration, I read somewhere that you began writing with fan fiction, which I think a lot of us in kind of this middle generation share that experience. I wanted to ask you a little bit about that and what your views are on the role of fandom in your work or in working.
Yeah, well, I guess in my work, I've been writing kind of stories on and off since I was very small. But the first time I was writing kind of consistently for an audience was when I got into fanfic as a teenager, and so I would say it was massively formative for me. It meant that it was something like, firstly, it meant that I actually finished my stories because that was kind of some kind of incentive. I'd share them and people would comment. It meant I had a kind of writing community. I mean, it was really influential, not just on me as a writer, but as a person, because I grew up in Malaysia. My parents were very overprotective. So I basically never went out. And what it meant was that I had access to a community of people who kind of respected me. Like they didn't see me as like someone's kid or just like a teenager. They saw me as someone who's creating kind of artistic work that they were reading. And that's something that I think was really important to me as a teenager. And yeah, just like having people read your work, talk to you about it, and then have people to talk to about writing. That was something that was really quite influential. And I would say, fanfics continue to play a role in my life. When I get into something, I will go look for fanfic to read of it, or if I really get into it, I'll write fanfic. And that's, like, to me now, like the purest form of play. I think when you write for publication, you get kind of there are all these external pressures that, like, can weigh you down. There's like commercial pressures. There's this idea that maybe you should write to the market. That's kind of like it's and then often in your head there's all these expectations that you're thinking, what would your editor want, what would your agent want, what would readers expect from you. Whereas I find, at least with fanfic, it's just divorced from all of those things. So it just means that it's something that where I really can say, okay, what do I want to see?
Can I ask you, what was the original property you were writing fanfic on when you first began?
I've been in so many fandoms that it's actually quite difficult to trace back. The fandom where I probably started reading fanfic, that probably got me reading fanfic, was actually Star Trek, I think.
Oh, wow.
Star Trek Voyager, I think it must have been. Because I've only really watched Next Generation and Voyager, so it must have been one or maybe both those series. And then what I started writing for, so I think my very first fanfic was Harry Potter, actually, but I was never really.
So was mine.
But the thing is, I was never really into the Harry Potter books. It's just that there was so much Harry Potter fanfic.
I think there was a period of time where we dominated all. There was, in fact, a fan fiction site. The one I wrote on was just Harry Potter fan fiction. So there was a time where that was the entire fan fiction kind of space.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it definitely could feel like that because it was so massive. But I I'd been in fanfic fandom for a while before Harry Potter, because it took me a while to get from reading to writing. But anyway, so I wrote like a Harry Potter fanfic as a one-off. But actually, the kind of what I think of as my first fandom, my first real kind of fanfic writing fandom, was Good Omens, the book. And of course, there's been a bit of a revival in that fandom since then because of the series. Yeah.
That is so interesting. I wonder how the fan fiction kind of landscape on Good Omens has changed since then. That's very interesting.
Oh, I think it's exploded massively.
Yeah,
I have a couple of friends
recently again.
Yeah, I've got a couple of friends who got really into the series, so I'm kind of vaguely aware of the like fanfic renaissance.
And of course, there's something which I think every interviewer asks you, but I do feel the need to ask you about kind of the different places you've lived in, what they mean for your work, Malaysia, Britain, just how that impacts, because you've written obviously books set in fictional Malaysia, you've written books set in Regency, England. So how this kind of varied experience, how does that impact your work?
Well, I think it comes out in a lot of different ways. I often write characters who are living between worlds, between cultures, between genders, even. So I think that's just one way. That's one way it comes out. I think yeah. In another way, like in some ways it comes out very directly. So one of the places I lived in was the US as a child, and so Blackwater Sister, my new novel is about a young woman who has spent most of her life in America. Her parents moved there with her when she was a toddler, and then at the time of the book, she's in her early 20s, and they're moving back to Malaysia because it's kind of not really gone that well for them in America. Their American dream has gone a bit sour. And that was kind of inspired by my childhood experience of moving to America and then coming back to Malaysia when we found Malaysia was a bit of a better fit. So that's kind of one way, but that's probably the first time, I guess, that I've drawn that directly on personal experience for a novel. Otherwise, it comes out in somewhat more, I guess, disguised ways. So Sorcerer to the Crown, I've been asked, that's my first novel. and Sorcerer to the Crown and the True Queen are set in the same world where they take place substantially in Regency Britain. And I've been asked before about like, why I set a novel in Britain, even though I have now lived in Britain for half my life. It's still, people still seem to find it surprising. But in a way, well, I don't think it's a fair question, but in a way it's a question I can answer in the same sense that it is asked, because I think of Sorcerer and the True Queen as books that I would have and could have written even if I lived in Malaysia all my life, because what they are attempts to kind of grapple with my childhood reading and I guess the colonial legacy. I think of them very much as my Commonwealth books in a way, kind of, being kind of dealing with that kind of whole British influence, and thinking about and I think one of the core statements it makes actually is I think sometimes about how Malaysia as it is now would not exist without the British Empire. That's true in a way of every British ex-colony, in its composition, its demographic, just everything, its territory, the languages spoken, the culture, in every sense it's a product of the British Empire. That means I'm a product of the British Empire. But what I was trying to say in a way with Sorcerer to the Crown and the True Queen, it was kind of revealing the centrality of empire to Britain itself. Because if you think of a kind of Regency romance novel or a Jane Austen novel, or these period films, they're very, very white, and they don't talk about the empire that they're built on. So all the wealth that, say, Mr. Darcy has, that all springs from, from empire, from trade, from kind of the exploitation of the economic resources of the colonial territories. That's not addressed directly ever, right? And I think Sorcerer to the Crown is about, the main character is a Black man, and then he meets a young woman who is mixed race. Her mom's Indian, her dad's British, and they are the main characters. And I just thought putting two people of color at the center of a story like that, which is kind of Jane Austen with dragons, in itself already kind of, I guess subverts the genre, or kind of is making a statement. It's saying, so what I was trying to say with Sorcerer to the Crown and the True Queen was, okay, maybe I'm a product of British Empire. Maybe the rest of us are massively shaped, but so are you. So are you, Britain. You wouldn't be Britain, the Britain you are now, without the rest of us, if that makes sense. Yes. So that's kind of what I was saying.
That does make a lot of sense. Now I have a bit of a frivolous question for you, just out of personal curiosity. What are some of your favorite foods? And I mean, like, kind of foods from when you were growing up, things like that.
That is such a hard question to answer, because there's like so many.
I should have given you time to prepare that.
well, most Malaysians are up for talking about food at all times. What's funny about me growing up? What's funny about me growing up is that I really I was obsessed with Western food. And I think because I didn't get it that often, like, it was definitely like special occasion stuff. So I grew up in an ethnic Chinese family in Malaysia, and it is a funny one. So my mom's really was really, I mean, now she's a bit more conservative about food. But she was really open-minded about food, and she ate, like, I would say, like a Malaysian. She like loved their Indian curries, loved Malay food, loved like she's actually Nonya, like her mom was Nonya, which is like a kind of like Peranakan is called as well, which is a kind of like hybrid culture in Malaysia with like these Chinese who kind of intermarried local. Well, they didn't really intermarry actually, but they kind of adopted, say, like Malay influenced dress and cuisine and so on. So Nonya food tends to be like spicier than Chinese food, and it like uses a lot more of the kind of local herbs and spices. Yeah, I know you don't, but just like thinking of like
no, I'm just imagining it now and wishing I could eat some.
So Nonya food I'm really keen on, and we definitely ate that growing up. But in our household, actually, because my dad was like, he just loves, I think his ideal cuisine is like Hong Kong, cuisine, like kind of Cantonese food, which is great, obviously. But we ate a lot of Chinese food at home growing up. That's why. And actually, like, it wasn't until I was a bit older that I started like eating more of the kind of other cuisines that Malaysia has to offer. so when I was growing up, like, like my favorite meal was probably boringly spaghetti bolognese. Because
But I think that's a good one. I think that says a lot also about how multicultural we all are.
Yeah, and we go to this like hotel restaurant for like special occasions, and I'd have my spaghetti bolognese with cheese on top. But like other things I really liked as well were like I'm really obsessed with like agar like jellies in general, but like not like Western jelly. Like British jelly tends to be really soft and wobbly. Like I like it with a bit of crunch
with a bite.
Right, yeah. With a little, like, it needs to kind of spring back. So
yes,
agar is good. Konnyaku is really good. Japanese konnyaku. Love nata de coco. And then I'm just like randomly, and like roti canai as well. Like I was really keen on growing up, which is like prata, right? And they you'd have it with dal, or like when I was a kid with sugar, just like straight up like dipping some.
I love roti canai, which that's still a number one comfort food.
That's so good. Yeah. It's such a great breakfast. Yeah. So I mean, I could go on, but I still cook a lot of kind of Southeast Asian and East Asian food like here, because like it's kind of lack of availability. Well, it's not really. Like I live in Birmingham, where you can actually get a decent amount of kind of East Asian and Southeast Asian food, and South Asian food as well, for that matter. So so I'm not precisely deprived. I do cook it fairly regularly as well.
I'm in Oxford, so I haven't found much, but there are some places where I can get some good Southeast Asian food.
That's good.
But that was just out of personal curiosity. But now I do have to ask you, I am reading your newest book, obviously, but that's like our coverage of that is going to come out much later after this interview. So I have to ask you to represent Blackwater Sister and what you can tell us about Blackwater Sister.
Yeah, so it's my first contemporary Malaysia set novel pre-COVID. It's about a young woman called Jess, and she I mean, I talked about it a little bit already, but she's moving back from America to Malaysia, where she was born. She spent most of her life in America, but her parents have encountered some reverses in their fortunes, so they're going back. And she starts hearing the voice of her dead grandmother in her head. So she and her grandmother Ama, she didn't know her well in life, but is sticking around because she's got unfinished business on Earth, and she decides that Jess is the person to help her with it. So Jess gets drawn into all kinds of adventures, magical, physical, and spiritual. So yeah, that's what the book is about. It's set in Penang, which is in the north of Malaysia.
Exciting. I've been to Penang, so that does sound fun.
That was amazing. Many thanks to Zen and Tejasri on behalf of our team and all our listeners. If you enjoyed this episode, please sign up for our newsletter. You can also subscribe and support our journal Mithila Review via Gumroad or Patreon. You will find the links in the description box below. If you're new to Mithila Review, here's a brief introduction. Mithila Review is an international science fiction and fantasy journal founded in late 2015. We publish literary, speculative fiction and poetry, occasional film and book reviews, essays and interviews from around the world. Every issue of Mithila Review has been made possible by generous contributions from our readers and patrons. We are a bunch of writers, lawyers, academicians, and students who are first and foremost lovers of good stories. If you believe in the work that Mithila has been doing for the past 5 years, then join us. Reach out to us at editor@mithilareview.com and help us in telling stories. You're also welcome to join our Facebook community, Asian Science Fiction and Fantasy, devoted to discussion, celebration, and exploration of SSF work and writers relevant to Asia and beyond. Thank you for becoming a part of this conversation. See you next time.